If you're new or returning to Destiny, there might be a certain type of enemy that throws you completely off guard. I'm talking about champions. Heads up everybody, my name is SentinelGray and welcome to the channel. Champions are an enemy in Destiny that was introduced when Shadowkeep came out, that expansion, and have been a staple of some sort in any difficult content in the game. A lot of the time, Bungie will throw champions in seasonal activities like the Astral Alignment or Override to bump up the difficulty a bit. Other times, you can find loads and loads of champions in the Grandmaster Nightfall Strikes, which are known as the hardest PvE activities in the game. Either way, you're bound to go toe-to-toe with champions while you play Destiny, but I guess the question that you're asking is, how do you deal with them? First thing though is if this video ends up helping you out, please be sure to leave a like and comment, because doing that type of stuff helps us YouTubers out a lot. I would greatly appreciate it. Currently, as of me making this video, there are 3 different types of champions. If they make more in the future, I have no idea. But they are Barrier, Overload, and Unstoppable. And there's no real easier quote-unquote champion to fight. You just have different ways to fight them. Barrier champions will produce a barrier around them once they take enough damage. Usually this is like a third of their health, or you hit them with something big and powerful like a rocket or a high-impact sniper. While this barrier is up, they are completely immune to all damage, regenerate their health at an absurd rate, and can attack you if you're within line of sight. The only way to break through and damage this barrier is with anti-barrier rounds. When you use anti-barrier rounds, you deal damage to the champion's barrier, and once the barrier is fully taken down, it'll stun the champion for around 5 seconds. Stunning a champion can do a number of things for you and your team. First, it puts the champion into a stun state where they won't even try to move, attack, or activate any of their crazy abilities. Second is that champions take more damage while they're stunned. And third, there's been a couple of mods recently where it'll reward you for stunning champions, so the mod will do things like give you back melee energy or grenade energy or something like that if you have those mods on. Another thing as well that I totally forgot to mention is that whenever you stun a champion, you cannot stun them for X amount of time. This doesn't work with barrier champs because barrier champs have to put up their barrier, but with the other champion types like Overload and Unstoppable, they have a cooldown for whenever you can stun them. So after they're stunned for about 5 seconds or however long, they take about 3 seconds until you can stun them again. Moving on, we have Overload champions. Overload champions have a gimmick where they are constantly regenerating their health and are usually pretty aggressive. Luckily, if you're doing an activity that isn't on Legend or a higher difficulty, you can generally overpower them with sheer burst DPS, but it does take a bit of effort to do so. The way to stun these champions are with Overload rounds, which work differently than anti-barrier rounds. Overload rounds activate on a gun after firing off a few shots. So if you have Overload SMG rounds, the Overload effect will activate once around 10% of the magazine is empty, so make sure you're aware of that whenever you go to use Overload rounds. However, for weapons with explosive payload or timed payload, this is very different. For weapons that have those types of perks, Overload rounds take half the time to activate because the game counts the explosive parts of those shots to be a separate tick of damage from the gun. As an example, it would take a True Prophecy with explosive payload 2 shots to overload an Overload champ, where a normal True Prophecy with no explosive payload would take 3 or 4 shots. Another big difference here is with bows. Every fully drawn shot from a bow with Overload rounds can stun an Overload champion. Stunning these champions is very much the same as stunning barriers. They don't move, attack, or activate abilities. And something I almost forgot. When fighting Overload champions, it's always good to keep hitting that champion with Overload rounds. Continuously hitting and overloading a champion with their respective rounds keeps them from regenerating health, activating their abilities, and, once their cooldown runs off, you can stun them over and over and over again. Just make sure if you keep on hitting an Overload champion, you keep the Overload rounds on them to make the fight a whole hell of a lot easier. Now we move on to Unstoppable champions. These champions are true to their name and will rush you non-stop until you stun them. All while you're trying to deal damage to these guys, they take about 50% of the damage that they normally would, so these things are tanks through and through. The nice part is that these champions are the only ones who don't regenerate their health, so as long as you can keep dodging them and staying out of their way, you don't actually have to stun them if you don't want to. However, stunning them makes them far more easier to handle. To stun an unstoppable champion, you of course need unstoppable rounds. To activate unstoppable rounds on your weapon, you need to ADS, or aim down sights, with the weapon for about a half second. You'll notice the weapon will get an effect, or like a red activation on your gun. This effect is to let you know that you have unstoppable rounds now active. Alright, so now that I've gone over all the champions, I'm assuming you're wondering, where do I get these anti-champion rounds? Well, you can find them on the seasonal artifact that you get every season. As soon as the season starts, you can check the artifact to see what types of guns have which types of anti-champion rounds on them in that current season. During the current season of when I'm making this video, the Season of the Lost, anti-barrier rounds are on auto rifles. Unstoppable rounds are on pulse rifles, sidearms, fusion rifles, and linear fusion rifles, and overload rounds are on bows and swords. Don't ask me how overload rounds work on swords, it's just the effect, don't worry about it. When you start leveling up the artifact, you'll get to unlock these mods for yourself, and it's almost always a good bet to unlock that entire first row of anti-champion mods first before anything else. Luckily, since these mods are armor mods for your gauntlets specifically, you can use these anti-champion rounds with exotic weapons as well as rare and uncommon ones if you really want to do that. And since this mod only costs 1 energy to slot into your armor, it shouldn't mess with your build too much if you have one. Next up, there are some exotics that have anti-champion rounds built into them. Ariana's Vow is built with anti-barrier, Divinity is built with overload, and Leviathan's Breath is built with unstoppable, just to name a few. Another tidbit of information just to give you so that you have it in the back of your mind. If you have, like for this season, we have overload rounds on bows. Leviathan's Breath, which is a heavy bow, has unstoppable rounds built into it. Whenever you have overload rounds on your armor, on your gauntlets for your bows, that does not affect the exotic weapons that have these anti-champion rounds built into it. So no matter what, Ariana's Vow is always going to have anti-barrier, Divinity is always going to have overload, and Leviathan's Breath is always going to have unstoppable. Those will never be overridden by whatever mods that you have on your armor. Now, the final thing that I want to touch on is how stasis affects champions. Currently, all 3 different champions are affected by stasis in their own way, and some are far better than others. Barrier champions honestly take stasis the best. Freezing a barrier champ will completely prevent it from producing its barrier and won't even allow it to regain its health or anything like that you would normally have, so feel free to use stasis on these guys. On overload champs, stasis is a lot of the times a hindrance more than a helper. Stasis for some reason resets overload champions, so if you stun an overload champion and then they immediately get frozen, that champion won't stay stunned. They'll break out and eventually start healing themselves and will continue to do what they keep on doing. Though that's not to say that stasis doesn't help. If overload champions are in fact giving your team a whole lot of trouble, it's probably far better to freeze the champion as opposed to, stunning it. For unstoppable champions, stasis works very similarly. Though the freeze effect lasts its normal duration on unstops, freezing them overall can screw with their stun mechanic, so be very aware of this whenever you get into fights with these baddies. So that's about it for the basics as far as champions are concerned. Don't get me wrong, these guys are far easier to take down when you fight them in a group of like 6, so whenever you're going to do the seasonal activities, I wouldn't sweat it as much. However, fighting them by yourself or on legend or higher difficulty can be pretty intense, so make sure you have the right anti-champion rounds that the game suggests that you bring in. The other thing too is, there is more detail that I can go into as far as champions are concerned, but that video would probably be twice as long and take twice as long to make. However, if it is something you guys want to see, please be sure to let me know down in the comments below. But that is going to be it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you all next time, and remember to keep your heads up and be kind to each other. Bye now.